Alright boys, you already know what it is. We're skipping the intro, getting right into the data, and first we're going to take a look at some games that were just not well optimized on Switch. One of the most well-known examples is Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, and we can see the poor optimization manifesting here as frame time delivery issues. At a glance it almost looks like it's locked at 30 FPS, but those frame time spikes make the experience feel sluggish and juddery in actual gameplay. And rest assured, this game does have frame rate issues later on, but we'll talk about those later. The frame time spikes are resolved once you enter battles, but the graphics are hanging on for dear life here. Moving over to Switch 2, and it's immediately obvious the benefits of the free update that those games received on Switch 2. The game received graphical updates to its resolution, graphical settings, the number of Pokemon that can render on screen, the draw distance. That's all fine, but in addition to that, we can see that the frame time issues have been completely resolved, and the game now stays locked at its new cap of 60 FPS. And the same remains true in battles. We get the opposite of what you want to see on your heart monitor, a perfectly flat line. The Switch 2 version is not completely perfect later in the game, but the smoothness here is transformative. Now before we go any further, why don't you take a seat? What's going on here, boys? Listen, I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed. But I know I can count on you to make the right decision here. Alright, let's get back to the games. Before we move on to look at more exaggerated examples of frame rate issues, I want to take a look at Shin Megami Tensei 5, because it's a good example of a game that has stuttery, inconsistent frame pacing right out of the gate, right in the intro section. This is right at the start of the game, and it's not a demanding area. Look at the minimap, it's basically a hallway, and yet it's littered with frame time spikes. Camera movement feels juddery and sluggish, and almost grating for those sensitive. Jump over to Switch 2 and it's the same thing. What was visually irritating stutter becomes buttery smooth. But I do understand frame time issues are a little subtle, so let's look at some more dramatic examples, shall we? So we've seen so far that the original Switch struggles with frame pacing during open world traversal, but a place where it completely shits the bed is when there's a ton of NPCs on screen. I think some of the best examples of this are Musou or Warriors style games. This one here is Fire Emblem Three Hopes, and it almost looks promising at a glance until you realize that the frame target here is actually 60 FPS, not 30. And the Switch just can't keep up here. It's terribly inconsistent. Honestly, a locked 30 FPS would have felt better. We pop over to Switch 2 and it's completely transformative. Not only does the game look sharper, but we're now locked at the 60 FPS cap the entire time. And the difference that this makes in smoothness in a fast-paced, combo-oriented style of game like this cannot be overstated. And we see basically the same thing in Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity. The frame rate cap is 30 on the original Switch in this one, but we're basically never hitting that. Frame rate is all over the place in the 20s or lower, and the game stutters when you exit menus and use abilities. It's just a mess. We jump over to Switch 2 and all of the frame rate inconsistencies are completely fixed. We're now locked at 30 all the time, and the gameplay feel is buttery smooth. And that really is a big deal in this style of game, because a locked, stable frame rate is really the only way that these games feel good to play. At least in my opinion, though I know I'm not unique in thinking that way. Here's Dragon Quest Builders 2. This is an example that was in the last video, and you really should go watch that. We talk a lot about what you should and should not expect from your Switch 2. I'll throw a card up on screen and I'll have a link in a pinned comment, but as you can see, this is another big sandboxy open world where the Switch just has no prayer of hitting that 60 FPS target. And again, sounding like a broken record here, but totally smooth on Switch 2, other than a little pause you can see for loading in some assets. But this kind of performance boost really matters, because that 30 FPS, the inconsistent frame rates, that's what kept a lot of people off of certain games on Switch. It's really nice to see that fixed on Switch 2. Now just as a quick side note, while the single player experience is as wonderful as it looks here for Dragon Quest Builders 2, not even the Switch 2 stood a chance in heavy multiplayer worlds. It's better, but it's definitely not fixed. And I think in exploring this topic, we've kind of come to the conclusion that the Switch was a very popular console, so a lot of companies were pushing their games onto the system. But in forcing these titles onto a handheld with such paltry hardware, there were some serious costs to both visuals and performance, as well as major concessions that had to be made in the design of the games themselves. Sure, we've got this open world we can traverse, but the world feels empty, there's pop-in everywhere, and the dynamic resolution is scaling back so hard it looks like a PS2 game, and not in a good way. Rune Factory 5 is another example of this that we also talked about in the last video. This was a title that was panned by both critics and fans of the franchise on release, for having a world that, despite being pared back to the point of feeling empty, still looked blurry and grainy and had very inconsistent, laggy performance. I wouldn't blame someone for wondering if this should have even been on Switch. We pop it into Switch 2 and the difference is immediately evident. The visuals are much sharper, the performance is smooth, and yeah, this one is functionally fixed, at least from a technical perspective, but I gotta say it's still a little disappointing that so many games required the next-gen console a decade later to have their issues resolved. It is really nice though that the Switch 2 does resolve a wide variety of issues. This is Shadowverse Champions Battle, and if you have even a passing interest in card games and haven't seen my review, you gotta check it out, dude. It's so good. I'll throw a card up here as well and leave a link in the pinned comment for that, but this game does have an issue with open world traversal stuttering, which is really just the Switch pressing pause to catch up on loading in assets, and you can see the insane pop-in and giant frame time spikes. On Switch 2, you'll see that the frame time graph is completely flat now, the stutters are completely eliminated. And there's still a little pop-in, that's just the way that the game was designed, but you can see it is loading assets across the entire map now. Admittedly, there's not a lot of open world traversal in this game, but stuttering is always really distracting, and this completely fixes it. One last area of improvement that we should cover here before we close things out on this one. There were a number of comments on the previous videos about how people are holding off on playing the Xenoblade Chronicles trilogy until they receive like a remaster or a Switch 2 edition, something that fixes the way that they get hit with the ugly stick by dynamic resolution scaling, especially in handheld mode. I think Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is probably the one that people call out the most on this. And it's a little challenging to give you a perfect idea filming the handheld screen, but I think you can tell it's pretty rough on Switch. Super low resolution, tons of aliasing artifacts, and this is just a starter area, we're not out in the open world. But I don't know, man, going over to Switch 2, it is vastly improved. I know it's not the full 1080p 60 Switch 2 edition that you're hoping for, but to my eye, it looks like a soft remaster. There are noticeable improvements to clarity and sharpness, way less artifacting. The Switch 2 isn't struggling just to stay alive like the Switch was. I'll do a little side-by-side just to illustrate my point. I think it's good enough personally now that you should really give it a shot. The series is good enough, it's worth it. And that Vaseline-smeared resolution is not just an issue isolated to Xenoblade Chronicles 2, it's every title in the series on Switch. But so too is the improvement on Switch 2, and it really is more dramatic in person than I'm able to capture with a camera pointed at a handheld. Alright, so to sum things up here, every single game in today's video received criticism on Switch for either its performance, its visuals, or both. Now, is calling them broken a little bit of a stretch? I mean, yeah, it's an attractive title, right? But it's not that much of a stretch. A lot of people put these games down, and a lot of these games people avoided intentionally because of these factors. And I wanted to draw some attention to the fact that the Switch 2 console does resolve the biggest strikes against almost every single one of these titles. Games that a lot of people deem to be unplayable or just decided to wait on because of the really bad performance. If you already happen to own a Switch 2 or you're considering purchasing one, treating your Switch 2 console like a Switch Pro model is the play, and you can fully embrace the Switch's incredible library without the concerns about performance that you would have had on the original model. It doesn't literally solve every single problem, but it's a huge step up in almost every single game. If you did make it this far, I really appreciate you sticking around to the end of the video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments on what you thought of this video and what you'd like to see next. I'm still enjoying doing the Switch 2 content right now, but if you'd like to see something else, let me know and I'll consider switching things up for you. Make sure you watch those videos in the pinned comments. If you liked this, you will like those. Appreciate you sticking around if you made it this far, and thanks for stopping by.